We continue now at the top of Daf Kufam and Beis in Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 100b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara was dealing with a contradiction within Rabbi Shimon in terms of an onein, whether a korban Pesach is brought on behalf of the onein or not. And the Gemara now continues with another answer. Rava Amar Rava says, Idi ve'idi achar chatzos. Both brises are talking after chatzos, meaning the person's relative died after chatzos. V'lo kashan, it's not difficult. Kan kodem sheshachtu v'zarku olav. In one case, we're talking where the relative died before they slaughtered and threw the blood, again for this person that was registered for the korban Pesach, and kan la'achar sheshachtu v'zarku olav. And here we're talking that it was after they did the slaughtering and they threw the blood, then the relative died, and that is the distinction between the two brises. And Rashi explains, Rava Amar Rava says, Amilsi de Rabbi Shimon Koi, we're going again on Rabbi Shimon's opinion, L'shanuye de Rabbi Shimon ad Rabbi Shimon. We're answering the contradiction within Rabbi Shimon in terms of whether a korban Pesach is brought for someone who is an onein. And the Gemara said again, Idi v'idi la'achar chatzos. Both brises are talking after chatzos. V'afilu meis la'achar chatzos. And the point is as follows. Even if the relative died after chatzos on the 14th of Nisan, now the obligation for korban Pesach has already set in. But if it was kodem sheshachtu olav, if it was before they actually slaughtered the korban Pesach for this individual, is leila Rabbi Shimon lo yavi as pischo. Rabbi Shimon says, still you do not bring the korban Pesach again, even though it's after chatzos. You don't bring the korban Pesach. You don't bring the korban Pesach for this individual because the pasuk says that we push off korban Pesach in this case because he's an onein, because it says shlamim. It says in the pasuk the word shlamim karbono, kol karbonos of lo yavi. We learn from shlamim karbono that his karbonos he shouldn't bring ela kishu shalim, only when he is whole, and an onein is not considered to be whole, and so therefore again, if he is an onein and they haven't yet slaughtered for him that korban Pesach, they don't do that. Udukatani onen tovel ve'ochal pischol erev, and the brisa which says that the onen immerses and does eat his korban Pesach in the evening, that's kishemes la'achar sheshachdu v'zarku olav. That's talking when the relative died after they already slaughtered and threw the blood for this individual who was registered for the korban Pesach, and then he actually does eat the korban Pesach at night, and that answers the contradiction within Rabbi Shimon. And the Gemara continues, Amarle Ravada bar Masna l'Rava. Ravada bar Masna said to Rava, Achar sheshachtu v'zarku es damo. But if we're talking in the brisa after they already slaughtered and threw the blood of the korban Pesach, so Mai dahava, so what happened, happened. And Rashi explains the question, Mai dahava, what happened, happened. The korban Pesach was already slaughtered, the blood was already thrown. Harei niftar, so he's exempt, that obligation was taken care of. V'yamai dachya achiloso aninos laila d'rabbanan tvei mishar kochim. Why should his eating of the korban Pesach now push off the aninas laila d'rabbanan more than any other kodshim? B'shalom li Abai, and Rashi explains, I understand according to Abaya's approach earlier, to muki lo bekodem sheshachtu v'zarku olav, he says that the brisa is talking where he became an onein before they actually slaughtered and threw the blood of the korban Pesach. Uv'la'achar chatzos chovas pesach cholo olav lohavi, so then after chatzos, the obligation to bring the korban Pesach does in fact set in. V'lo sharis leila ochlo, and then we said, as Rashi said earlier, if you're not going to allow him to eat the korban Pesach, lo maisi, he might not end up actually bringing the korban Pesach, which could be a problem that involves kares. Hilkach lo hamidu divreim. Therefore, for that reason, the Rabbanan said that they were not going to restrict him from eating it in order to make sure that he does bring the korban Pesach. Ela l'Rava, but according to Rava, amai lo hamidu, why didn't they leave their restriction in place? Why should he be allowed to eat the korban Pesach? They already slaughtered and threw the blood of the korban Pesach. That obligation was taken care of. Hakvar shachad v'zark, it was already slaughtered, the blood was already thrown, and so therefore, again, why are we allowing him to eat korban Pesach in this situation? And the Gemara continues, Amarle Ravina said to him, Achilas psachim mi'akva, that the eating of the korban Pesach is a requirement according to this approach, midarabba bar Rav Huna, and it's from what Rabba bar Rav Huna says. Rashi explains, Hachi Garsin, Amarle Ravina said to him, Achilas psachim mi'akva, the eating of the korban Pesach is required, midarabba bar Rav Huna, that's from Rabba bar Rav Huna, l'kamon, my sin-in-law. As the Gemara goes on, they will bring Rabba bar Rav Huna. And the Gemara continues, Amar le, Rava said to Ravada, Tzayis mai dekamar lach Rabbach, listen to what your Rebbe Ravina is saying to you. Rashi explains, Amar le Rava le Ravada, Tzayis mai dekamar lach Rabbach. Rava said to Ravada, listen to what your Rebbe is saying, meaning your Rebbe Ravina, Shmalo, listen to your Rebbe Ravina, Sheyafe heshivcha al sheilatzcha, he's giving you a good answer to your question. And the Gemara continues, "My de Rabba bar Rav Huna." What is this statement of Rabba bar Rav Huna that indicates that eating the Korban Pesach is required? Tanya, as we learned in a Braisa, Yom Shemua, the day that the person hears the relative dies, Ki Yom Kavura, that's the same as the day of burial. LeMitzvah Shiva Ushloshim, in terms of the mitzvah of Shiva and Shloshim, when it comes to Avelus, when it comes to mourning. V'la'achilas Psachim, and in terms of eating Korban Pesach, Ki Yom Likod Atzamos, it's like the day of the gathering of the bones. And Echad Zev Yechad Zev, and in both of these situations, Tovel, he immerses, V'yochel B'Kodshim La'erev, and he eats Kodshim in the evening. And Rashi explains, Yom Shemua, the day of hearing the news, Sheshama Shemes Lo Meis, a person hears that his relative died, Uvishmua Krova Shebesoch Lamed Askinan, we're talking about where he hears the news relatively soon, he hears it within 30 days. So that day of the Shmua, Ki Yom Kvura LeMitzvah Shiva Ushloshim, in terms of Shiva and Shloshim of Avelus, that's like the day of burial. Meaning, Miyom Shmua Maschil Limnos Zayin L'Rechitzu Unilas Asandol V'Lamed L'Giyotz. It's from the day of hearing about the mace that he begins to count the 7 days of Shiva, which have halachas in terms of Rechitza, Nilas Asandol, and that's when he begins to count the Shloshim. V'La'achilas Psachim. Now, in terms of eating Korban Pesach, so there we said it's Ki Yom Likod Atzamos, that's what the Brisa said. Have a Yom Shmua, the day of hearing the news of the relative's death, Ki Yom Likod Atzamos, is like the day of the collecting of the bones. The Kaimalan B'Psachim and Peraka Isha, because we've established in Psachim and Peraka Isha, Hashomeya Al Meso, a person hears news about his relative who died, V'Hamelaket Atzamos, and someone who collects the bones, Tovel V'Ochel B'Kodshim Lo Erev, he immerses and eats Kodshim in the evening. V'havinon ba, and we ask over there in the Gemara, Malaket Atzamos, if he's actually collecting the bones, Hazah Shlishi V'zayin boy, doesn't he need sprinkling on the 3rd and 7 days? He would need to go through a whole purification process. He's Tameh. Umeshaninan, and the Gemara over there answers, Ema, rather say what it really means is, Shaliktu lo acherim atzamos, that others collected the bones for him. The Amrinan b'moed katan, because we say in moed katan, Hamalaket Atzmos aviv v'imo, if somebody collects the bones of his father and his mother, Hareza misabel aleim kol hayom, he's in Avelus all that day. V'yashmiinon b'psachim, and it's teaching us in Psachim de lo erev that evening, mutter b'kodshim, he's mutter to have kodshim. V'hachashmiinon, and here it's teaching us, Yom Shmua, when it comes to the day that he hears the news of the relative dying, l'inyan achilas psachim, in terms of eating of Korban Pesach, lo ki Yom Kavuru, it's not like the day of burial. Te'ilu Yom Kavuru, because on the day of the burial, lo achal pischol erev, he would not have been allowed to eat his Korban Pesach in the evening. V'yafilu meis be'esmal b'yud gimel, even if the mace actually died yesterday on the 13th. Ela ki yom likod atzamos havi, rather, it's like the day of the collecting of the bones, umutter b'chol hakodshim, and it's mutter by all kodshim. Now, v'hada nakat psachim, the reason why we're focusing specifically on psachim, mishum de yom kavura nakat leila meimar de yom kavura, afilu pesach nami lo. We mentioned psachim because in terms of the yom kavura, the day of the burial, we want to say that on the yom kavura, even the Korban Pesach is not allowed. And Rashi continues, the Brisa then said, Echad zeh v'echad zeh, in both of these cases he immerses and eats kodshim in the evening. Al karchach hayom kavura v'yom likod kai. Rashi says you have to say, what's the Echad zeh v'echad zeh referring to? It's referring to both the Yom Kavura, the day of burial, and the Yom Likod, the day of collecting of the bones. In both of those cases he immerses and has kodshim in the evening. V'kasha reisha l'seifa k'delakamon, and according to that, we're going to end up having a contradiction between the beginning and the end of this Brisa, as the Gemara is about to say. And Rashi says, Di'iyah yom shmua v'yom likud. Now, if you're going to try to say that echad zeh v'echad zeh is going on the day that he hears the news of the relative dying and the day of the collecting of the bones, but then lo shaykh lemisni echad zeh v'echad zeh, then you wouldn't phrase it as echad zeh v'echad zeh. Tekeven d'minai usala, because since the Brisa just mentioned those, zeh v'zeh miboyle, it should have just said zeh v'zeh. By saying echad zeh v'echad zeh, it is clearly going on Yom Kavura and Yom Likud, and again, then we have a contradiction within the Brisa itself. As the Gemara now continues and asks, Hagufa Kasha, the Brisa is contradicting itself. Amrit, first the Brisa said, Yom Shmua ki Yom Kavura, that the day of hearing the news is like the day of the burial, LeMitzvah Shiva u'Shloshim, in terms of the mitzvah of Shiva and Shloshim, V'la'achilas Psachim, but in terms of eating Korban Pesach, ki Yom Likod Atzamos, the Yom Shmua is like the day of Likod Atzamos, and Michlal, so that implies the Yom Kavura, that the actual day of burial is stricter than Likod Atzamos. Afilu le'erev nami loachal, that even in the evening, he shouldn't be able to eat the psachim. V'hadar tani, but then the brisa ends up saying, echad zev v'echad zev, that both in this and in that situation, meaning both by the Yom Kvura and the Likut Atzamos, tovel v'ochel b'kadshim la'erev, he can immerse, and he does eat kadshim in the evening, so it's a contradiction in terms of the Yom Kvura. Are we strict on the Yom Kvura? He's not allowed to eat kadshim in the evening, or are we lenient by the Yom Kvura? And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Rav Chisda says, Tanoi, that issue is actually a machlokas Tanoim. Rabba bar Rav Huna Amar, Rabba bar Rav Huna says, Lo kash, it's not difficult. Kan sheshama shmua al meso, samuch l'shkias acham. In one case, he heard the news about his relative dying near shkias achama. V'chein sheliktu lo at samos, samuch l'shkias achama. And also by the collecting of the bones that was near shkias achama, near sunset. V'chein shemes lo mes, v'kavro. And also in the case where his relative died and they buried the relative, samuch l'shkias achama, it was next to, near shkias achama, near sunset. V'kan, but over here, la'achar shkias achama, it was after sunset, and that is the difference between the two statements in the Brisa. And Rashi explains, Tovel v'ochel b'kadshim la'erev. Again, it said at the end of the Brisa, he can immerse and eat kadshim in the evening. V'kol shekein pischo. If he can eat other kadshim, for sure he can eat his karban pesach. Kiyom likut atzamos. It's like the day of the collecting of the bones. Mashma v'lo kiyom kvura. It sounds like it's saying the hearing of the news is like the likut atzamos, where we're more lenient, and not like Yom Kvura, where we're stricter. Te'ilu Yom Kvura lo achel pischo la'erev. Because again, when it comes to Yom Kvura, it's sounding like it's saying he cannot eat the karban pesach in the evening, and that contradicts what it says at the end of the Brisa. And again, the first answer of the Gemara was Tanoi, it's a machlokas Tanoim. De pligi belel Yom Kvura she'ena Yom Misa. There's a machlokas if it's the night of the day when they did the burial, but it wasn't actually the day of death. There's a machlokas about that night. De ikol amanda amar tafes leilo midrabanon. One says the night also follows with the restrictions midrabanon. V'savar achilas psachim lo ma'akva, and also holds, that Tana holds that you don't have to eat the karban pesach. Hilkach afilu pesach lo achal, therefore even the karban pesach is not eaten. Ulekamon ma'isi lahu, and the Gemara later on, as the Gemara goes on, it will bring this machlokas Tanoim. And Rabba bar Rav Huna Amar, Rabba bar Rav Huna says, Kan sheshama shmua, o sheloktu lo atzamos, o shekavar meso b'yadalit samach l'shkias achama. In one case we're talking where everything happened right before sunset, v'kan la'achar shkias achama. And in the other situation we're talking after sunset, meaning as follows. Seiva dekatani, at the end of the Brisa where it says, Bekulhu ochel kachim, it says in all of these situations, even by the day of burial, he can eat kachim in the evening. V'kol shekein pischo, and certainly he can eat his karban pesach. That is kishaba'alav echon me'elu lifnei shkias achama. That's when any of these happened before sunset. Tahavale lo'erev leil yom kavura, then what would end up happening is that evening becomes the night of the day of the burial, the night after. V'leil yom shmu, it's the night after hearing the news. V'leil b'yom likut atzamos, it's the night after the likut atzamos. V'savar, and so the Brisa, that opinion holds, Yom Kavura lo tafes leilo afilu midrabanan, that the day of the burial, the night is not even going to be restricted on a derabanan level, even that's even Yom Kavura. V'kol shekein Yom Shmua v'likut atzamos, that would certainly be true on the days where he hears the news or the collecting of the bones. V'hadatani reisha, and that which the beginning of the Brisa says, v'lachilas psachim k'yom likut atzamos, where it's saying that for eating the karban pesach, hearing the news is like the day where the bones are collected. Te'ilu Yom Kavura lo achal, which sounds like we'd be strict on the Yom Kavura, and he would not be able to eat the karban pesach. That's kisheira lo echon me'elu. That's talking specifically when one of these events happens la'achar shkias hachama, after sunset. Dahavale laila ze Yom Kavura atzmo. That would mean that the night itself is the time of the burial. V'lo leil Yom Kavura. It's not the night after the day of the burial. Afagav da'af humi derabanan. Even though this also is only a restriction on a derabanan level, hechmiru b'Yom Kavura atzmo yoser miyom shmua v'likot la'osra b'pesach. They were strict on the actual day of the burial more than Yom Shmua, the day of hearing, more than the day of collecting the bones, to say that he's osir in the karban pesach. Aval b'yom likut, but on the day of the collecting of the bones, lo asru b'pesach, they did not forbid him when it comes to karban pesach. Ela b'shar kachim hitzrichu lahamten ad erev, but by other kachim they did say he has to wait until the evening. V'hachi kamar, and so therefore this is what the Brisa is saying. La'achilas psachim, when it comes to the eating of the karban pesach, have a yom shmua ki yom likut. The day of hearing the news of the death is the same as the day of the collecting of the bones. V'ochel pischo, and he can eat his karban pesach. V'afilu shama oliket achar shkia, even if he heard or the bones were collected after sunset. Yom shmua atzmo, so it's literally the day of hearing. V'yom likot atzamos, it's literally the actual day of the collecting of the bones. V'afilu hachishari, nevertheless, it is permitted to eat the Karban Pesach. Masha'ein ken b'yom kvura atzmo, that would not be true on the actual day of burial. De'ilu meis lo meis b'yud gimel. Now, if the relative would die on the 13th, v'kavru also amimim la'achar shkia, and then would be buried after sunset, to yudalit, after the sunset of the 14th, asr lechol b'pesach, then it would be asr to eat the Karban Pesach, v'af agav dechala olav simchas haregel, even though the holiday actually started, the simcha of the holiday started, ve'eno noeg avelos b'regel, and there is no avelos on the holiday, hani mili avelos to midrabanan, that's true by avelos, which is drabanan. Uchsiv v'samachta b'chagecha, it says v'samachta b'chagecha, so it cancels the avelos. Avol aninos le'aser b'kachim, but when it comes to aninos, and there we say he's forbidden in kachim, chala olav, that actually does take effect. V'yechad zeh, and both by the day of burial and the likat atzamos, heichad debo olav mi ba'od yom, if that happened while it was still day before sunset, then ochel b'kachim l'erev, then he could eat kachim in the evening, delaylo lo tafis, because the night doesn't have those restrictions. Umiu b'yom aser b'shachim, but nevertheless, during the day itself, it would be forbidden by other kachim, afilu yom shmua v'likot atzamos, even the day again of hearing the news, or the day of the collecting of the bones, bar mi pesach, again with the exception of Karban Pesach, kidim efarish time of Yazal, as the Gemara will explain. As the Gemara now continues and asks, li'achar shkias achama, if it happened after shkias achama, after sunset, my dahava, what happened, why should he be allowed to eat the Karban Pesach? He can't have other kachim, as Rashi just said. Elashma mina, rather we see from here, achilas psachim mi'akva, that the eating of the Karban Pesach is a requirement, and again that was the purpose of bringing this, to show this idea that according to Rabbi Bar Rav Huna, the eating of the Karban Pesach is a requirement. And Rashi explains, "My dahava, what happened, umali Pesach, umali shar kachim." Again, what's the difference between Karban Pesach and other kachim? Ha'amrit, we just said before, kachim aser biyom likot lebo bayom. Again, if it's the day of the collecting of the bones, if it's that day, so kachim are aser, kedakatani lo erev. Uva Pesach, amai sharisle. So if that's true by Karban Pesach, why is it permitted? Why is Karban Pesach different? And again, the Gemara said, achilas psachim ma'akeves, the eating of the Karban Pesach is required. Lo ha'amidu divrayim b'makom kares, and they didn't keep the restriction in place in a situation of kares. Umiu, now nevertheless, biyom kavura, in a situation where it was the actual day of burial, ha'amidu divrayim, there the Rabbanan did keep the restriction in place, mishum derubo kavri biyom misa, because the majority are buried on the day of death, va'asi lemishra yom misa atzmo, and therefore people are going to come to permit the day of death itself. There it wouldn't be permitted. V'yesh mekomos she'amidu divrayim b'makom kares, there are situations where the Rabbanan keep their restrictions in place, even in situations of kares, kedamrinan b'psachim bo'isha, like we say in Meseches psachim. And the Gemara continues with another answer to the internal contradiction in the Brisa. Rav Ashi says, "My echad zeh, what does it mean at the end of the Brisa when it says both in this situation and in that situation he can immerse and he can eat kachim? Hachi kamar means to say as follows: echad yom shmua ve'echad yom likut. It means both the day of hearing the news of the relative's death and the day of the collecting of the bones, but it is not talking about the day of burial. Tovel v'ochel b'kachim l'erev, he can immerse and eat kachim in the evening. But the Gemara says, v'hadar Rav Ashi Badusi, this answer of Rav Ashi is a mistake. As Rashi already said, Michti Allah Koi, again, we're already going on those two situations, Yom Shmu and Yom Likot Atzamos. You wouldn't say Echad Zeh v'Echad Zeh, Zeh v'Zeh mi boile. It should have said Zeh v'Zeh if that was the case. Elashma mina Badusi, rather we see that this answer is a mistake. And the Gemara continues and asks, Umay Tanoi, what was the machlokas Tanoim that Rav Chisda was referring to, again, with regards to the internal contradiction in the Brisa? The contradiction was on the Yom Kvura, on the day of burial, the night after that day of burial. Is the person allowed to eat kachim or not? Is the aninus restriction of eating kachim, is that still in place the night after the burial or not? And Rav Chisda answered that contradiction by saying that issue is a machlokas Tanoim. Where do we find that machlokas Tanoim? And the Gemara continues, Detanya, as we learned in the following following brisa, ad mosai misonin olav, until when is the period of aninus? Kol hayom, it's the entire day. Rebbe says, kol zman shelo nikbar, as long as the mace was not buried. And right now the Gemara thinks the Rebbe is being lenient. It's not aninus the whole day. Once there's the burial of the mace, there's no more aninus. And the Gemara says, b'may askinan, what exactly is this brisa talking about? Ilema biyom misa, if we're going to say that this brisa is talking about in the day of death, so the relative died, and the Tanakam is saying that the aninus is the whole day, and Rebbe is saying it's not even the whole day, it's only until the burial. If that's the case, mi'iko de lesle de yom misa the toughest leilo midrabanan, does anyone not agree that the day of death, that the night after the day of death is going to continue aninus on a drabanan level? Certainly, you wouldn't say kol hayom means to say the entire day and not the following night. But the yom misa, certainly it would be the following night, and everyone should agree to that. Vesu, and further, Rebbe Omer calls man shelo nikbar. Rebbe says that the aninus is calls man shelo nikbar as long as the mace hasn't been buried. Hakavro ishtrile, but if the mace has been buried, then suddenly it's permitted. There's no more aninus. Umi ika delesle v'acharisa kiyomar. Is there anyone who doesn't agree to v'acharisa kiyomar, which is the idea that the aninus should be the entire day? And so therefore that cannot be the explanation of this brisa. And so Amar Rav Sheshes says, Ayom Kavurakai, we're going on the day of burial. So according to this explanation, the Tanakam is saying that on the day of burial, it's not the day of death, but it's the day of burial. So Kol Hayom, the entire day there is aninus and not the night. And Rebbe would be saying not even the entire day. Rebbe would be saying once there's a burial, so then there is no aninus. Ma'askef Flor Rav Yosef asks on this explanation, still we need clarification. El Hadikatani Hashomea al Meso Kimalaket Atzamos, but the brisa which says that somebody hears the news of his relative dying, it's like the day of the collecting of the bones. Tovel v'yochel bekachim la'erev, and on that day the person is allowed to immerse and eat kachim in the evening. So mechlal, so again that would imply, as we said above, the yom kavura, that on the day of the actual burial, afilu la'erev nami loachel, that there are restrictions in the evening. He can't eat kachim in the evening. So hamani, so who would that follow? Again, we're completely lenient. We're saying over here that on the yom kavura, on the day of the burial, it's either going to be the whole day but not that night, or we're going to say it stops at the time of the burial. So elatar, it's rather you have to explain, you have to answer this brisa as follows. The machlokas tanoim is as follows. Ad mosai misonin olav, the Tanakama says, how long is the period of the aninus? Kol oso hayom villelo. It's that entire day and the following night. The aninus does stretch into the night. And Rebbe says, kol zman shelo nikbar, that's true if there's no burial. Avol nikbar, but once there's a burial below leilo, then it doesn't stretch into the night. Again, it's only the day, but it doesn't go into that night. Now, on this explanation, Amru Akami de Rabbi Yirmiyah, they said this over in front of Rabbi Yirmiyah. Amar, he said, Gavra Rabbak Rav Yosef Le Mahachi, will a great person like Rav Yosef actually say such an answer? Because even according to this answer, Rebbe is the one being more lenient. Lema de Rebbe Lakula, will we say that Rebbe is being more lenient in this brisa? That cannot be for the following reason. V'atanya, but we learned in a brisa, Ad Mosai Mison in Olav, again, how long is the period of Aninus? Calls man she'eno nikbar afilu mikan v'yad asara yomim. Divrei Rebbe says if there was no burial, that continues the period of the Aninus. It could even go for 10 days, according to Rebbe. You see that Rebbe is the strict one. The Chachamim say, Ein Mison in Olav, ela oso hayom bilvad. The Aninus is only going to be that day. And so you see that Rebbe is much stricter when it comes to the period of the Aninus. And so Ella Taretz Hachi. So finally the Gemara says, rather the way to understand the Brisa is as follows. Ad Mosai Mison in Olav, how long is the period of Aninus? Kol oso hayom below leilo. It's that entire day, but the Aninus does not go into the night after the day of the burial. And Rebbe says, Kol zman shelo nikbar. That's as long as there was no burial. V'im nikbar, and if there was a burial, tofes leilo. So then the night does actually, the restrictions of the Aninus do continue into the night. And here we see a machlokas tanoim. This is why we're bringing this. We see a machlokas tanoim in terms of the day of the burial, the Yom Kavura, whether or not the following night continues the Aninus. Rebbe says it does, and the Tanakama is more lenient and says it does not. And Rashi explains, V'atanya, we learned in a brisa again that Rebbe is l'chumra, Alma Rebbe l'chumra amra. You see that Rebbe is saying some kind of chumra against the Tanakama. V'keven deleka lefrushe plugsa d'rabbanan lechol ba'odo mutal lefanav. Now you can't say that the machlokas is talking when the mace is still in front of him and hasn't been buried. That can't be the situation of the machlokas. There, everybody should agree that we are strict. V'al karchach beleil yom kvura pligi. So you have to say the machlokas between Rebbe and the Rabbanan is the night following the day of the burial. That's what they're actually arguing about. To Ka'amar Rebbe is saying, Afilu kavro l'sof yud yamim, even if the burial took place after 10 days, misonen olav leil yom kvura. The aninus is going to continue the night after the day of the burial. The Chachamim Omer, and the Chachamim say, Eino misonen olav biyom kvura ela yom atzma. The day of burial, the aninus is only that day. Avalo leilo, it does not include the following night. V'hainu tanoi de Rav Chisda. And that is the machlokas tanoim that Rav Chisda was referring to. And the Gemara continues, Amru Akame de Rava, they said this over in front of Rava, and Rava said, Midukama Rebbe Yom Kavura Tofes Leilo Midrabanan. If Rebbe over here is saying that the day of burial, the night following, continues the restrictions of Aninus on a Drabanan level, Mechlal de Yom Misa Tofes Leilo Midoraisa, that would imply that on the actual day of death, the night following that day would be Aninus on a Doraisa level. Visava Rebbe Aninus Laila Doraisa, does Rebbe really hold that the Aninus of the following night is Doraisa? Vatanya, but we learned in a brisa, Hein Hayom, it says in the pasuk Hein Hayom, that's Aharon HaKohen talking about Aninus, and it means Ani Hayom Asr, I am Asr today, V'layla Mutter, and the night is Mutter, Uladoros, and for future generations, Bein Bayom Uvein B'layla Asr, both during the day and at night is Asr, Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, these are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Omer, Rabbi says, Aninus Laila, Einami Divrei Torah, the Aninus at night is not Doraisa, Elami Divrei Sofrim, it's only Midrabanan. Here it seems that Rabbi holds it's Durabanan, and the Gemara says Liolam Durabanan. It is Durabanan, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Kuf Aleph Amud Aleph.